There is a belief that once a nation reaches the top, it stays there, that superpower status is a permanent condition, and dominance once achieved cannot be undone. But if you look at history, you will see that this belief has never held true. Not once. Every empire that has ever existed has eventually declined. Every superpower that has ever risen has eventually weakened. And the argument I want to make today is that the idea of permanent stability at the top is not just wrong. It is dangerous. When we think about superpowers, we instinctively focus on their visible strengths, military capabilities, economic output, technological advancements, cultural influence. But what we rarely examine are the invisible forces working against them, the structural weaknesses, the contradictions built into the system itself, the pressures that accumulate slowly, quietly, beneath the surface. Because power is not simply a matter of accumulation, it is a matter of balance. And balance is extraordinarily difficult to maintain over extended periods of time. Think about what it actually takes to remain a superpower. You need continuous economic growth, political legitimacy, social stability, control over critical resources, technological superiority, and, perhaps most importantly, the ability to project influence without overcommitting your resources. But here is the challenge. As a nation becomes more powerful, each of these requirements becomes harder to satisfy because power creates expectations. Expectations create obligations. Obligations create costs. Costs that grow faster than the capacity to manage them. And this is where the pressure begins to build. Economically, you start to see diminishing returns on investment. Politically, you start to see increased internal competition for resources. Socially, you start to see widening inequality and fracturing consensus. Strategically, you start to see commitments that exceed your actual capabilities. This last point is critical because every superpower, at some stage in its trajectory, overstretches. It takes on more responsibilities than it can sustain. It intervenes in more conflicts than it can resolve. It guarantees more security than it can provide. Slowly, the gap between commitment and capacity begins to widen. Now, this does not manifest as sudden collapse. It is gradual, almost imperceptible, often invisible to those living inside the system, because from within, everything still seems to function normally. The government still operates, the economy still produces, the military still deploys, the global influence still registers. But beneath that functioning exterior, something fundamental is changing. This is where the concept of illusion becomes important. Stability is not purely objective, it is also psychological. As long as people believe a system is stable, it behaves as though it is stable. Markets remain confident, allies remain committed, rivals remain cautious. But once that belief begins to erode, the entire structure starts to shift. Confidence is the invisible architecture of power, in financial systems, in political institutions, in international alliances. And when confidence weakens, it triggers a cascade. Investors begin to hedge, allies begin to recalculate, rivals begin to probe for weakness, and what appeared solid suddenly reveals itself to be fragile. Now, here is what makes this particularly interesting. Superpowers rarely fall because of external conquest alone. More often, they fall because internal vulnerabilities make them unable to respond effectively to external challenges. When a nation is internally cohesive, it can absorb significant external shocks. But when it is internally divided, even relatively minor external pressures can produce disproportionate consequences. This is the pattern we see repeating throughout history. Not sudden invasion or overwhelming force, but internal erosion that reduces the capacity to respond when external challenges arise. So when people discuss superpower stability, they often focus on the wrong metrics. They analyze military budgets, track GDP growth, measure technological output, but they overlook the more fundamental question: is this system sustainable? Can it maintain this level of output, this degree of control, this extent of influence indefinitely? That is the question that actually determines longevity. Because stability is not a static condition, it is a dynamic equilibrium. It requires constant recalibration, constant adaptation, constant investment in maintaining the balance between capacity and commitment. And the moment that balance tips, the decline begins. Let me explain why this matters. Right now, we are living in a period where assumptions about stability are being tested, where structures that seem permanent are showing signs of stress, where systems that appeared unshakable are beginning to reveal their limitations. The question is not whether these systems will adapt, the question is whether they can adapt quickly enough. Because the nature of decline is that it accelerates. In the early stages, problems are manageable. The cracks are small. The adjustments required are modest. But if those adjustments are not made, the cracks widen, the problems compound, and eventually the system reaches a point where the required changes become politically impossible to implement. This is the trap. The longer a superpower delays addressing its structural weaknesses, the more painful the necessary corrections become. And the more painful the corrections, the more resistance they generate, until finally, the system becomes locked into a trajectory it can no longer control. Think about what this means in practical terms. It means that by the time decline becomes obvious to everyone, it is often too late to reverse. Because the political will required to make difficult changes only emerges when crisis is undeniable. But by that point, the crisis has usually progressed beyond where those changes could succeed. This creates a paradox. The visibility of decline is inversely related to the ability to prevent it. When decline is still preventable, it is not yet visible enough to generate action. When it becomes visible enough to generate action, it is often no longer preventable. This is why superpower transitions tend to surprise people, not because the warning signs were absent, but because they were ignored until they became impossible to ignore. And by then, the momentum has already shifted. So what should we be watching for? Not dramatic collapses or sudden shocks, but the subtle indicators of system stress, the growing gap between rhetoric and reality, the increasing difficulty in achieving stated objectives, the rising cost of maintaining existing commitments, the declining return on strategic investments. These are the signals that matter, not because they predict immediate collapse, but because they indicate that the system is operating under increasing strain. And strain over time produces fractures. Now I want to be clear about something. This is not a prediction of imminent collapse. This is an observation about the nature of power itself, that it contains within it the seeds of its own limitation. That dominance creates dependencies. Dependencies create vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities, if unaddressed, eventually become critical weaknesses. Every superpower that has ever existed has faced this challenge, and most have failed to navigate it successfully, not because they lacked intelligence or resources, but because the political and psychological barriers to reform are extraordinarily high when a system still appears to function. Why make painful changes when everything seems fine? This is the illusion. That because the system still operates, it must still be sound. That because institutions still exist, they must still be effective. That because power is still projected, it must still be sustainable. But operation is not the same as health. Existence is not the same as effectiveness. Projection is not the same as sustainability. These distinctions matter because they determine whether a system can adapt before it is forced to collapse. Adaptation requires something that superpowers historically struggle with: the ability to acknowledge weakness while still appearing strong, to reduce commitments while maintaining credibility, to reform structures while preserving stability. This is an incredibly difficult balance to strike, perhaps the most difficult balance in all of statecraft. Because the moment you acknowledge weakness, you invite challenge. The moment you reduce commitments, you create doubt. The moment you reform structures, you generate resistance. And yet, without these changes, the alternative is not stability. It is eventual breakdown. So the real question is not whether superpowers decline. History has already answered that. They always do, eventually. The real question is whether decline can be managed, whether it can be gradual rather than sudden, controlled rather than chaotic, adaptive rather than catastrophic. That depends entirely on whether the illusion of permanent stability can be replaced with the recognition of constant change. Because stability is not about maintaining a fixed position. It is about maintaining the capacity to adjust to shifting conditions. The greatest threat to any superpower is not external rivalry, it is internal rigidity, the inability to change when change is required. This is what we should be watching, not the strength of armies or the size of economies, but the flexibility of systems, the capacity for reform, the willingness to adapt. Because in the end, survival is not about power. It is about adaptability. The superpowers that fail to understand this become the cautionary tales that future generations study, not as examples of strength, but as examples of what happens when the illusion of stability becomes more important than the reality of change. And once that happens, decline is no longer a possibility. It becomes inevitable.